The idea of life as a monk or nun is portrayed in movies like The Sound of Music and has evolved significantly since the days of the early church. Monks weren't always the target of Viking raids, the copiers of religious documents, or the brewers of ale. They started off as people who swore a vow of poverty and devoted themselves to the hardships of life in order to gain the riches of heaven. Saint Anthony, Saint Pachomius, and Cassian were three of the main fathers of monasticism. Anthony was the father of eremitic monasticism, or in plain words, the monks who lived alone in the desert. Saint Pachomius was the first to organize these monks into a community, and Cassian brought these ideas to the West. Saint Benedict was one of the hermits who was asked to lead the Cenobitic monastery by monks who wished to form one. He wrote the Rule of Saint Benedict, which provided guidelines for monks living in a community. Egyptian by descent, Anthony was born in 251 AD to parents who were devoted Christians. Anthony also adopted the same Christian faith. His childhood was constricted from world knowledge, and all he knew was his parents and home. Anthony didn't care about playing with the other boys in the neighborhood. All he wanted to do was study the Bible and live a simple life. He later studied Acts 5, a story about a couple selling their possessions, brought and laid it at the feet of the apostle for a chance to receive the great hope in heaven. Pondering over what he had studied, he happened to hear the Bible being read. "If thou wouldest be perfect, go and sell that hast, and give to the poor, and come follow me, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven." Anthony immediately left the church service, went home and gathered his possessions, 300 acres of land, gave them away to the elders of the village, sold the smaller items, and the money he got, he gave it to the poor, and reserved a little for his sister's sake. There was no monastery in Egypt at this time, and no monk was familiar with the desert. However, those who wanted to practice solitude, they could go to a nearby village. In the nearby village, there was a man already who was practicing a hermit life. Anthony felt impressed, so he went and settled himself in solitude outside the village. He sought encouragement from another man who was also practicing solitude, and so Anthony spent his days in constant prayers, memorizing scripture, and practiced discipline. Monasticism was developed by individual hermits who advocated life apart from the world. Anthony is credited as the father of this form of monasticism, known as a eremitical monasticism. Now, what were some factors that led to monasticism? To look at this, we need to go back to when Christians were being persecuted by Diocletian, but were still growing in numbers and were fervent and faithful to the beliefs that they upheld. Diocletian was one of the heaviest persecutors of the Christian faith. Once Diocletian died, and many battles after, Constantine took over the empire. One day, at the battle, Constantine had his religious experience, a vision. While this experience supposedly leads to him becoming a Christian, many view this conversion as a political strategy rather than a genuine conversion. Some base this on the fact that he still held onto many things that a non-Christian would do, such as murder and his lack of fighting against paganism in the empire. However, his so-called conversion still leads to a big change in the empire. Since 312, Constantine showed his favoritism towards the Christians without hiding it, in contrast to Diocletian. Christian leaders enjoyed the same benefits that pagan priests enjoyed, so eventually, during Constantine's rule, things started changing the view on Christians from being the lowest of society and outlaws, and to the emperor's religion. This meant that Christians no longer had to hide away and have their worships underground, but now they could speak in the streets. This meant that the mission of spreading the gospel would be easier and more powerful. However, there was a negative side to it. Because the emperor became Christian, he still thought that he could rule the church as he did his empire, with everyone obeying his order, even if it morally was wrong or went against the church beliefs. Constantine's coins had the pagan symbol of the sun god on one side, and on the other side had letters which represented the Christ. This type of double standard allowed for a great deal of corruption to enter the church. Not only was that a problem, but there were those who were not interested in religion at all, but rather had political interest. And since the emperor was Christian, it would be of great advantage to be on the same side as the emperor. The problem with this was that these people still practiced paganism. Thus, there were a mixture of beliefs going into people's heads, and this became a common norm. This led to some very negative effects, because it created Christians that only half-heartedly served the Lord. Many were in the faith just for the benefits. The church was lowering its standards in order to gain popularity. In contrast to the stage of persecution, when people were genuinely converting to the faith and willing to die for what they believed in essence, the church lost its passion and flair to preach and live the pure life that the Bible calls the believer to live. This created a big reaction in some believers, getting away from the big empire and searching how they could bring back the purity of the church, which in their eyes had gone astray, and no longer was there discipline or purity. Thus, something had to be done. In this, one of the factors that led to the development of monasticism, the study of scripture and taking verses literally and looking at the example of the essence and John the Baptist is another factor that led people to develop monasticism. An eremitic monk hides away from the world to live an isolated life in prayer and meditation, eating only when necessary and living alone. While the monks, following the idea set forward by St. Anthony, some of them did not possess the skills or the physical ability to live individually in the desert. These monks were organized by St. Pachomius and lived in individual huts but had shared dining and worship spaces. Cenobitic monks lived together and formed the communal settlements that we find today. They soon became centers of religious learning and began to preserve and copy religious texts. In the West, monasticism rose in the cenobitic form. Rules for monks were soon established and monastic orders were formed. Monks who chose to follow a set of rules became part of that order. Orders like the Franciscan Order, Dominican Order, and the Order of Saint Benedict are some of the most common ones. The monks abandoned traditional ideas by selling everything they owned and taking a vow of poverty. They swore a vow of celibacy and took to praying and meditating every day. In the West, Cenobitic monasticism took hold and many monastic orders were soon developed. These monks lived together in monasteries and soon took on duties to assist their commune in various ways. Saint Pachomius is credited to be the founder of Cenobitic communal monasticism. Pachomius organized the monks into houses based on their trade and skills, and placed a head over each house. The overall head of the monastery became known by the Syrian word for father, Abba or Abbot. Each house contained around 40 monks, and each monastery had about 30 to 40 monks. The monastery was filled with people from almost every trade, and so was full of industrial life. Monks would manufacture goods and farm the land in order to sell excess goods at the marketplace or trade them for items needed. Monasteries soon became centers of spiritual learning.